Welcome everybody. I'm so glad you could make it today. This is our STEM lecture series, and I'm so happy that we could have our very own Professor Dr. Dean Leavitt. And I want to tell you a little bit about his background before we get started on this amazing topic that he's going to present to us. Again, I want to just thank you for attending today. I see you're all wearing masks. If you don't mind, I'll have you keep them on. We'll let the speaker keep his off during the talk so we can hear him and really appreciate his lecture. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Leavitt. He got involved in research as an undergraduate, working in a lab doing evolutionary genetics, genetics of lizards at BYU in Utah. He focused on molecular evolution of the mitochondrial cytochrome B protein as an undergrad. He did his master's work at BYU, where he focused on the boundaries and phylogenetics of desert night lizard. For his doctorate, he was in a joint program with SDSU and UC Davis, and he continued his work with molecular phylogenetics, working on lizards, and he focused on the evolutionary aspects of the western banded geckos and alligator lizards. He currently also does work doing research with the San Diego Natural History Museum, and his research there focuses on the evolutionary genetics of the Baja California snakes and lizards. He's also helped out with a conservation project in Southern California, specifically helping conserve the arroyo toad and the flat-tailed horned lizard. Most of his research is, as you can see, on reptilian species, but he also dabbles in spider diversity. And he's actually published some work on lichens, so quite a diverse background for him. So I'm really pleased to have Dr. Leavitt here. Again, just a reminder for anyone that's here, I'm going to ask you to keep your masks on so that Dr. Leavitt can give his talk, and please welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, great to have you here. I see a few of my students here, so thanks for coming. Other folks, I don't know if you're interested in reptiles or if you're Game of Thrones fans, but hopefully both. All right. So, as you can see, the title of the talk is How the Dragons Lost Their Eggs. And I'll admit I am a Game of Thrones fan. I don't know it well enough where I know all the dragons' names or anything like that, but I do sometimes watch it, and as a biologist, kind of, think about the biology of the dragons, perhaps more than the writers of the show think about the biology of the dragons. As you know, the dragons from Game of Thrones are fantasy. It is a fun fantasy show. But can we think about dragons in real life? I think maybe we can. All right. There are dragons that are real creatures. This lizard right here goes by a variety of names, including the frilled dragon. It's an Australian lizard. Pretty remarkable, and if you kind of notice that frill along its neck, if you've ever seen Jurassic Park, one of the dinosaurs was kind of modeled after the frilled dragon. Maybe one of your friends or yourself has a pet bearded dragon, right? Not quite the ferocity of the dragons from Game of Thrones, but pretty dragony nonetheless. Right? That thing almost looks like it wants to breathe fire at you. So Australians, I think they just love to call their lizards dragons, is really what it boils down to. This is another Australian lizard known as the Australian water dragon. There's also a Chinese water dragon as well. So, probably the Chinese have a pretty rich history as far as their dragon interest and symbology, symbols. This is one of my favorite dragons, bar none. This thing is it really looks like a dragon to me. This is a Philippine sailfin dragon, and maybe of all the lizards out there, this is the one that to me looks most like a dragon. All right, but it's a 3-foot-long lizard from Philippines and into Indonesia. Another very dragony-looking animal is also from Southeast Asia. This is the Bornean earless monitor, and I included this photo because I don't know. I look at that face, and to me, it just screams dragon. But as far as lizards and dragons go, it's maybe the best known dragon of them all. Komodo dragon. Oh, maybe the Komodo dragon. I would agree with that. All right. So Yeah, if you're talking about dragons, really the big dragon out there is the Komodo dragon. This is a monitor lizard from Indonesia, island of Komodo, near the island of Flores, and it is the largest lizard in the world, getting, around 10 feet in length and big enough to, yes, eat you if it wanted to, and you weren't careful enough. Okay, so definitely we have dragons, right? And you're thinking, well, I'm a Game of Thrones fan. None of these dragons fly. What's up with wings? Well, what about this? Oh, this isn't real. Okay. Not a real photo, but it is based on a real lizard, a gecko. And yeah, it doesn't have wings, but that thing looks pretty dragony right there. Okay, this is a gecko from Madagascar. So, no lizards with wings? Well, kind of. We actually do have some dragony, some flying dragons. All right, there is a genus of lizards from Southeast Asia, including Philippines and Indonesia. They're in the genus Draco. Draco just happens to be Latin for, oh, well, that's right, dragon. And these things can't fly like, say, the Game of Thrones dragons can, but they're pretty remarkably talented as far as gliding from tree to tree. So we're close to flying dragons, all right? I think this counts. It's a dragon. Its name is right there. All right. What about fire? Any lizards, breathe fire, say Dracaris, and they start burning things down? What? Okay, no. That's kind of, I don't know how that would work physiologically. All right, those proteins would denature way too fast. What these dragons have in common, though, with the dragons from Game of Thrones or elsewhere, is these are scaly reptiles, right? And that's really kind of the hallmark of these lizards. It was a while ago now, but when the BBC and David Attenborough came out with their series Life in Cold Blood, this was a series that dealt with amphibians and reptiles. One, I was super excited because I love the quality of BBC's footage. But then, seeing that kind of applied to lizards, etc., I was really excited. The episode that focused most on lizards was called Dragons of the Dry, right? And I think I like that. And how, BBC kind of pitched this is thinking about scales, and dragon scales is important to think about how vertebrates essentially were able to colonize land. So scales are keratinized structures, right? Not all reptiles and amphibians have scales. In fact, you're likely familiar with frogs and toads. They do not have scales. Their skin is very different than the skin of snakes and lizards. Their skin is soft. It always needs to be wet or moist, right? It can't dry out. And because of that, amphibians like frogs and salamanders, they're restricted to where they can live. They can live in ponds, they can live under moist logs, but some of them can live where it's somewhat dry. This toad right here is known as a spadefoot toad. It can actually live in some pretty dry areas, but what does it do most of the time? It's underground in a rodent burrow where humidity is high because its skin can't dry out, right? But once you have scales, you can start living where it's dry. You can live in deserts and be active during the day. You can live in salt water and not worry about losing your cells, losing all their moisture due to the difference in molarity, right? So having scales was a really big deal as far as vertebrates invading new habitats like land, like marine environments. Now, the scales of reptiles, they are packed full of these proteins called keratin, right? And the outermost layers of skin are essentially more or less pure keratin, and these cells are essentially inactive or dead now, but that keratin provides strength and durability. And you are not that different from these reptiles. Yeah, you might not have scales, but your hair, your skin, your fingernails is using the same type of proteins as these reptiles are, right? And the fact that mammals have keratinized skin is one of the adaptations that allows mammals to flourish on land in salt water. So having scales or a keratinized integument like a lizard Really big deal as far as being able to invade land. And lizards are really cool because kind of their classification is highlighting the fact that they have scales. Lizards are in a group called Lepidosauria, which translates to the scaled lizards. You may kind of contrast that to the name Dinosauria, right? What does anyone know what Dinosauria or dinosaurs mean? Dino means terrible. So they're the terrible lizards, all right? Who would you prefer? Scaled lizards or terrible? These are great. All right, dinosaurs aren't terrible. Maybe we'll talk about them a little bit in just a minute. Within Lepidosauria, they're in a smaller group known as Squamata, which is also coming from a Latin word which means the scaled ones. And this is more a narrow group that includes lizards and snakes. So look at this remarkable lizard right here, living in the extreme hot, dry desert of the Australian outback. Right, active during the day, really is a dragon of the dry. All right, and this lizard is known as the thorny devil. So not quite a dragon, but its genus name is Moloch, which is named after a mythical monster. Right, so not a dragon, but pretty adjacent. This animal's skin and scales are so amazing. Not only does it protect it from drying out in this desert, when there is rain or moisture, that moisture actually flows through tiny little channels on its scale towards its mouth, and that's how it drinks. That's how it gets its water. Incredible. Really, really, they are dragons of the dry. All right, so that's one of the things that makes lizards dragons. But if you're a Game of Thrones fan, you've likely noticed that eggs play a pretty big role in the show as well. First season of Game of Thrones was pretty exciting. Daenerys gets married, wedding gift, she gets these 3 dragon eggs. That was all fine and good, but when things really got good is when those dragon eggs hatched and Daenerys became the mother of dragons, right? I was like, ooh, this show is going next level at this point. All right, so those eggs and those eggs hatching, that was a big deal. The new, what is it called, House of Dragons, in the same vein, again, dragons and dragon eggs play a pretty big role. Damon here is pretty into eggs and stealing eggs and all sorts of mischief. Nonetheless, dragon eggs are a big deal, and as you know from the title of the talk, the talk is about how did the dragons lose their eggs. All right, so this is like the closest thing, real egg, that I think actually looks like a dragon egg. All right, I have one from the same species. I'll pass it around. This is no longer a viable egg. You're not going to hatch a dragon from this. There's a little hole here. I apologize. I'm telling you that so you don't steal it and take it home and try to hatch out your own dragon. That would be cool. All right. But yeah, you can pick that up, handle it. You've handled chicken eggs before, maybe when you're baking, make an omelet, etc. This is kind of like a giant chicken egg, but looks a lot more like a dragon egg. Does anyone know what kind of animal this egg came from? Is an emu egg. All right. That's almost like those dragon eggs on Game of Thrones. This one has some nice green coloration, where the one I'm passing around is a little bit darker, but nonetheless, you can imagine it being a dragon egg. Okay, so just like the evolution of scales was like a really big deal as far as vertebrates evolving to live on land, being able to withstand dry environments, the evolution of the shelled egg is the other hallmark that really allowed vertebrates to adapt to live in places away from the pond, away from the stream. So the evolution of shelled eggs was just a very important thing in the evolution of vertebrates, and we refer to this shelled egg as the amniotic egg. There's a protective shell. This shell is hard, protects what's inside, but the shell is breathable. Respiratory gases, oxygen, CO2 can pass through this shell. Interestingly, it's not watertight. Eggs need to have some humidity or they can dry out. If anyone's incubated chicken eggs or duck eggs as a kid, you know that adding some water to the incubator is important, even if it's still in a dry general area. You also might know that most bird eggs, you can drown the egg if they're submerged in water. What's in there developing needs oxygen, needs to release CO2. And so it's hard, protective, but it's still breathable. Really, really remarkable. All right, so contrast, that emu egg, a chicken egg, with other vertebrate eggs, with fish eggs, with, what kind of eggs are we looking at right here, do you think? Yeah, these are frog eggs. Frog eggs, amphibians do some remarkable things reproductively. They find some pretty amazing ways to, places to lay their eggs, some really, a lot of innovation as far as they don't all just lay their eggs in water, but nonetheless, all frog eggs are kind of similar in that they're in a jelly-like substance. There's no protective shell, so they are restricted to developing where there's water or it's otherwise damp or moist, right? Amphibian means that they're both in the water and the land. They're still tied to water. Where having a shelled egg, having scales, allows reptiles and maybe mammals to break away from a watery lifestyle. All right, so the amnio egg, it's not just about the shell. The shell is great, right? Protective, breathable, all right? But the egg has other things going on. Where is this term coming from, the amniotic egg? Well, there are 4 membranes inside of the amniotic egg. The amnion is one of those membranes. The amnion is a membrane that surrounds the developing embryo. Right, so that's one of the membranes. There's another membrane right here that surrounds the yolk. That's known as the yolk sac. There is the chorion. The chorion is this large membrane. It's essentially going to make contact with the protective shell. The chorion is going to be involved in gas exchange, right? Absorbing oxygen, releasing CO2. The amnion is cushioning the developing embryo. The yolk sac is containing the nutrients, proteins, lipids, etc., that are helping fuel the development of that embryo. And then the 4th membrane is coming off the hindgut right here. It's known as the allantois. And this membrane right here is kind of a couple purposes. One of those, it's holding metabolic wastes, and it is also involved with gas exchange. Right, so these 4 membranes, 3 of these are unique to a group of animals known as amniotes. Right? Yeah, some fish, some amphibians, or most fish amphibians, they have a yolk sac where that's fueling their development. But these other 3 membranes are unique to amniotes. All right, so I'm using this term amniote. What is an amniote? Well, we have an amniote right here, right? This little dwarf crocodile hatching out of its egg. Crocodilians are pretty close, kind of dragon-like, but none of their names include dragons, so they're kind of kicked out of Dragon Club, right? It's just lizards as far as I'm concerned, with an asterisk right there. But still, nonetheless, look at that shelled egg, right? And crocodilians can develop outside of water. Okay, what's another amnio? Look at these cute little turtles. Pinch their cheek if they had a cheek. They don't really have one. Nonetheless, they're adorable. Look, and again, here we have the shelled amniotic egg. Okay. So again, what is an amniote? Well, part of the answer clearly is reptiles, right? Reptiles are amniotes. Like, here's another different species of one of those dragons. Again, genus Draco, dragon, these things can fly. All right, are those the only amniotes? Reptiles the only amniotes? Or are there any other amniotes out there? We're including birds. Okay, so birds are amniotes. We pass around that emu egg. Definitely an amniote. We won't get into the nitty-gritty today, but we'll touch on it. Birds are technically reptiles, so yep, they are in fact amniotes. Is that it? Just reptiles? Mrs. Platypus says no, not just reptiles, all right? Mammals are also amniotes. And you see this platypus, you might think of a variety of things, but one of the things that pop in your head is like, oh, that is right. Platypuses lay eggs, in fact, amniotic eggs. Right, here is an egg and a hatching egg from a monotreme, which is a group of mammals that platypuses belong to. So I'm not just talking about reptiles with keratinized skin with the amniotic egg. I'm including mammals here as well, right? They're also important for mammals and the fact that we're here. So generally, not all amniotic eggs have that really calcified shell like we think of with a bird egg, right? Some shells are more leathery, like the shells of snakes, for instance, some lizards, and platypuses and echidnas. Now, this shell, these eggs, notice these eggs are a lot bigger than frog eggs, than fish eggs. And with that size, they can fit more yolk in there. That yolk will fuel development of the embryo. That embryo, with that size, with that yolk, can develop into a larger size within that egg than, say, a frog can. And it kind of, with that head start, it might also have the chance to evolve to be a larger species, right? The max size frog or salamander is smaller than the maximum size lizard or turtle or crocodilian or mammal for that matter. Now, with frogs and most fish, they're laying these jelly-like eggs in the water. Fertilization is external to the female's body. With a shelled egg, external fertilization is no longer possible. All fertilization has to be internal, and that kind of makes sense, right? How does sperm meet ovum if it's going to be inside of a shell, right? That has to take place inside the body of the female. Now, so eggs characterize amniotes, reptiles and mammals, but we know not all mammals lay eggs, right? Eggs, as we think of them, have been secondary lost in some amniotes, like most mammals and some live-bearing lizards, which will be the focus of what we talked about today. Well, maybe we can kind of look at that right now. Maybe let's watch a video of a lizard that is no longer laying eggs. So let's check this out right here. This is a lizard known as the Chinese crocodile lizard. It's a semi-aquatic lizard. If you go to the San Diego Zoo, you might have a chance of seeing some. It's using the birthing pool before that was trendy, right? Maybe the lizards are what made it so popular. And there you go. A little baby lizard emerges from its mother, starts taking its first breath. Now, I thought that video was pretty amazing. If you looked, let's see if we can go back there. Right there, right? I think what we're seeing a couple things right here. All right, we saw that little lizard scurry away, emerge, and start taking its first breaths. But what else are we seeing? We're seeing some remnants of the yolk sac. I think we're actually seeing some thin remnants of a shell as well. Keep those things in mind, okay? All right. So let's go back. Oh, here we are. All right. So again, it's not just lizards that are laying eggs or reptiles that are laying eggs, and it's not just mammals that are giving live birth. Okay. But as far as mammals go that lay eggs, the platypus is probably the poster child for those mammals. It's in a group known as monotremes. There's only one species of platypus. You know it's found in Australia, where strange creatures seem to abound. It's not the only egg-laying mammal out there. There are 4 species of echidnas, also known as spiny anteaters, which are also from Australia and New Guinea region. Now, all of these 5 species, they all lay shelled amniotic eggs that are leathery. The females actually have a pouch where at least with the platypus, where the eggs are incubated. The eggs hatch. The incubation period isn't super long, and as mammals do, the females feed their offspring with milk. Interestingly, monotremes feed their babies with milk, not using nipples, but rather they have glands on their belly that are secreting milk onto the fur, and the little baby, there's a little baby platypus right there, it will drink that milk from the fur patches on the belly of its mother. Pretty remarkable. All right, so monotremes lay eggs. What about other mammals? Well, we know that other mammals don't lay eggs, right? Other mammals are giving birth to live young. How How do kangaroos reproduce? Well, they give birth to very tiny young, very tiny babies. Then what happens next?
They grow in the pouch.
Yeah, they crawl to the pouch of the mother where they latch onto a nipple and drink milk, and they kind of finish their development inside of the pouch. In fact, sometimes the pouch is referred to as like the second womb for marsupials, right? And there's about 300 to 400 species of marsupials. Most of them are in where?
Australia.
Australia, that's right. And then after that, South America has a fair number of marsupials. Some of those possums, etc., that are South American in origin make their way up into Mexico and United States as well, right? Who here has seen the Virginia possum in their backyard? Anyone? Just me? All right. Anyway, we have a handful of or at least one marsupial around. Most mammals that we deal with, though, the vast majority, right? We have 5 monotremes, 360 marsupials, then 5,000 to 6,000 what are known as eutherian mammals. Most of the mammals that we interact with are eutherian mammals, and we know that they don't lay eggs. They're giving birth to essentially well-developed young that aren't spending any time in the pouch. So what's up? So did mammals just give up on the egg? Well, kind of, right? They gave up on the shelled egg, but if we look at the anatomy of what's going on inside of the mother, we'll see that those membranes that make up the shelled amniotic egg are still there, even if that calcified or leathery shell is absent, right? So here we have a shelled egg, right, with the shell, the chorion, the amnion, the allantois, the yolk sac. Well, we can look at a developing embryo in a eutherian mammal. What do we see? We see a yolk sac, we see an allantois, we see a chorion, we see an amnion. Those 4 membranes are retained in mammals like us as well. So the egg didn't go away completely, right? It's just been modified. All right, let's get, we leave mammals, get back to the start of the show, the dragons, right? What do we have right here? Little baby Komodo dragon hatching. We'll just take a second to watch a Komodo dragon, a video of a Komodo dragon coming out of the egg. It's just really cute. You thought those baby dragons in Game of Thrones were cute on Daenerys' shoulder. This is way cuter. So just like when humans are born, they kind of have to transition to using their lungs to get their oxygen versus oxygen from the umbilical cord. Similarly, reptiles hatching out of the egg transition from using the oxygen that's coming in through the chorion membrane to getting oxygen via their lungs, right? So there's still kind of the first breaths type situation with hatching lizards and snakes. He's like, I've had enough. I'm going back home. It's safer in my egg. Okay, buddy. Okay. All right. Pretty cute. Has anyone seen the Komodo dragons at the San Diego Zoo? I think when I took a couple of my classes there right before Thanksgiving, I know for most of the days the Komodo dragons were off exhibit. But do you know why? Well, they were having breeding trials in the back, right? So the Komodo dragons at the San Diego Zoo are breeding. There might be some baby dragons in a few months, all right? I talked to the lead keeper there. I'm friends with him there, so fingers crossed baby dragons are on the way in San Diego. All right. So we pass around a chicken egg, emu egg. It's pretty close to a dinosaur egg. Let's talk for a minute about snakes. Snakes are, in fact, just a modified form of lizard. They're very much, they had a lizard ancestor. They've undergone some pretty amazing evolution where, of course, they've lost their limbs. They've gotten very long, and they've gained some other attributes as well that are kind of uniquely snake-like. Snakes lack eyelids, all right? So if you ever see a movie, cough, cough, Harry Potter and a snake blinks, that's wrong, all right? Biology's off. Snakes can't blink. Some snakes like this rattlesnake, they actually can detect infrared heat with these pits on their face. Pretty remarkable. And another thing about snakes is no snakes have external ears. So their hearing isn't great, but they can sense vibration. All right, so you can go. I think you can go online. You can find viable emu eggs if you want to try to incubate emu eggs. Of course, you can go to the grocery store. You might make an emu, I don't know, omelet or something like that. That'd be an expensive omelet. Go to the grocery store. You can buy chicken eggs. Maybe certain stores will have quail eggs or duck eggs. How many of you have seen lizard eggs or snake eggs for sale? No one? All right. Well, so I happened to be, I was visiting my wife's family over Thanksgiving, driving. That's up in the Central Valley. Driving home to San Diego. I didn't want to take the Grapevine. I decided to head kind of the desert route. Going through the desert. I don't know where I was, but I ended up in some small little town buying some caffeinated drink to keep me awake. And there was a little, gift shop section there in this gas station. I was kind of, half checking it out, and there I saw it. Rattlesnake eggs for sale. What? I jumped at the chance, all right? I bought a few different packages of these rattlesnake eggs. I've never seen them. I was excited for them. I was so excited. I left some at home, my personal stash, but I brought some rattlesnake eggs here, all right? Who wants to check out some rattlesnake eggs? Want to check some out? All right. Wait for a minute, all right? Read the packaging. What's on it to look at? You did? Oh, all right. Read the packaging. Make sure I've tried to keep them kind of in a safe place. Once you read the packaging, maybe open those up. Tell us what rattlesnake eggs look at. All right. You may have heard when you open those envelopes, it makes a bit of a noise. All right. Why is it making a noise? Well, rattlesnake eggs, these are actually a gimmick that have been around for, I don't know, decades, all right, in gift shops throughout the Southwest. And what it is this envelope. Inside the envelope is a little wire with a washer on a rubber band. You kind of wind that up, and then when you open the envelope, that washer kind of rattles around. You folks didn't get too scared, all right, which is good, because if you would have been, you were, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, you can get a bit of a start, okay? You can go to YouTube and watch people's reactions to open rattlesnake eggs, and it's you folks did well relative to what you can see online, okay? So I didn't buy rattlesnake eggs. I don't know that would be, well, I don't know, it'd be legal, let alone it's not possible. You cannot buy rattlesnake eggs even on the black market, all right? Why not? Rattlesnakes don't lay eggs. They give live birth. All right? We got a little cute baby rattlesnake. Don't pinch his cheek. All right. Maybe you can watch a couple minutes of a clip. This is a biologist from Arizona that last week, hiking around, saw a western diamondback rattlesnake. He came back a few minutes later, like 45 minutes later, yeah? And we came back. He looked where the rattlesnake was, and suddenly there's a whole spaghetti bowl of rattlesnake. All right. So you can see the rattlesnake's giving birth. There's a few babies there. You can see the amniotic membrane still surrounding the babies. See the little tongues flick, getting their first breaths. All right. So, if you can think snakes are cute, all right, yeah, these rattlesnake babies are simultaneously adorable and, don't touch them, right? So keep your hands off as you have that temptation to tickle babies or whatever. But nonetheless, our rattlesnakes are giving live birth. So as we've kind of already seen, reptiles, including snakes and lizards, are together a group. Some of them give live birth. So we can think of, first, how many times did viviparity or live birth evolve in mammals? Any guesses? think just one. All right, we think just one. How many times did it evolve within snakes and lizards? Twice? All right. 3 or 4? Okay. Over 110 times. Okay. Over 110 times viviparity has evolved within snakes and lizards. All right. Some of these snakes and lizards have really interesting intermediate stages where maybe they lay an egg but it hatches after a couple weeks. In some cases, they're eggs that hatch after a couple days or even hours. We'll look at an even stranger case in a little bit. All right. So this right here, this diagram is a diagram called a phylogeny. All right. A phylogeny is a diagram that depicts evolutionary hypotheses among different organisms. Right? We've looked at kind of 3 different groups of mammals before, right? We talked our egg-laying monotremes, our marsupials, most of the females have a pouch, and then our eutherians, aka our placental mammals, right? So these marsupials, they have a short pregnancy, long lactation time in the pouch. Eutherians generally have a longer pregnancy, but then they're feeding milk to their offspring for a shorter period of time. So we think, so what a phylogeny does is it's showing hypothesized evolutionary relationships, and where these different lines come together represent common ancestors. So this is the common ancestor of all mammals. We assume that that common ancestor of all mammals was an egg-laying mammal. Similar, but still different than monotremes today. Right here is another place where branches come together. That represents the common ancestor of both marsupials and the rest of eutherians. So we think that that common ancestor, somewhere between this time and this time, evolved live birth a single time. All right. So I've used a couple terms that I probably should have defined first, but I'm going to define them right now. Right. So the first one is oviparity. Right? Oviparity is laying eggs, right? So an embryo is developing in an egg outside of the female's body. Let's jump down to this one, viviparity. Viviparity is where embryos are developing within the uterus of the female and are nourished by the mother's tissues. The embryos grow within the mother and are born live. And there's a third term called ovoviviparity. And this is where embryos are developing in an egg, but that egg is held within the female's reproductive tract. So they're nourished by a yolk, not via tissues of the mother. So these embryos essentially hatch in the egg that is inside their mother and then leave as live born. Now these 3 terms have been kind of the traditional terms that have been used for reptile parity modes. Lately, at least, it seems that folks are kind of moving away from these 3 terms, and they're just using oviparity and viviparity, egg-laying and live birth. So our egg-laying term is the same. Let's kind of refine our viviparity. In this case, viviparity is just that embryos are developing inside the mother and they're born alive. Okay? But within viviparity, there are differences, right? In one case, there are some embryos are known as licithotrophic. Licithotrophic embryos are those that are nourished by a yolk. All right. That's contrasted with embryos that are known as placentatrophic. With placentatrophic, here we have young that are developed via nourishment that's coming from the placenta, right? From connection to the mother. So most herpetologists or biologists dealing with this now, they don't really talk about ovoviviparity. It's just viviparity and oviparity with some fun differences in viviparity. All right, so I mentioned the placenta. Let's define the placenta really quickly. The placenta is an organ that connects the fetus to the uterine wall for nutrient uptake. And the placenta is a really fascinating structure that's essentially an organ made up of both maternal and fetal tissues. Really, really cool. And we talked about mammals have a single origin of viviparity. Despite that, they have pretty different placentas. The marsupials have what's known as a choriovinylene placenta This placenta is a combination of the yolk sac and the chorion. Sometimes it's known just as a yolk sac placenta. Now, this placenta of a marsupial, it's not very vascularized. The young don't deeply implant in the uterus of the female. There's a lot of gas exchange with this placenta, right? Oxygen from the mother, CO2 from the embryo back to the female's bloodstream, and otherwise there's not a lot of nutrients moving across this placenta. There are some nutrients that are transferred to the developing embryo that are referred to as uterine milk. Contrast that with the placenta of eutherian mammals, like humans, like your pet dog, like whales, etc. In this case, the placenta is made up of different membranes. It's still the chorion is involved, that outermost membrane, but the other membrane involved is the allantois. So this is known as a chorioallantoic placenta. And this placenta is a much more vascularized organ, meaning there's a lot more tissue from a surface area perspective. There's a lot more blood vessels essentially interacting from the mother side and the fetal side to not just exchange gases, but exchange amino acids, lipids, carbohydrates, etc. Right? This embryo is deeply implanting into the uterus and is very much connected. So you can see here, again, this is a really remarkable structure, and that it's both fetal and maternal tissue that are essentially fused during the pregnancy, and there's all this interfolding. These little fingers are known as villi, and this creates a huge surface area for the circulatory system of the mother to interact with the circulatory system of the developing embryo, right? Okay. So we still have, thinking about eutherians like you, like your pet cat, still have our four membranes, right? We have our amnion surrounding the developing embryo. We have the chorion on the outside here, and in fact interacting with the placenta here. We have the allantois interacting with the placenta here. And what's our other membrane? Our yolk sac. But wait a minute. We just talked about viviparity a couple slides ago, and with viviparity we either have licithotrophic, embryos that use nutrients from the yolk, or we have placentatrophic, embryos that use nutrition from the placenta. What's going on with the yolk? Right? Here we have a eutherian embryo right here, and circled is what? It's the yolk sac. What's unique about the yolk sac of humans and other eutherians? It's empty. There's no nutrition there, right? Birds, other reptiles, turtles, crocodilians, in the yolk, there are these proteins called phylogenies. There's a kind of a number of genes. These proteins are really big proteins, full of like a whole array of amino acids. They're good at carrying lipids and carbohydrates. They're really like, all the food that an embryo needs to develop, they're inside the yolk. Well, now that we have the placenta connection, those nutrients are no longer needed, and that yolk sac is empty. But you can still see it in like a ultrasound. It's still there in those early stages of development. Pretty remarkable. All right, so you can think of this yolk sac in like humans as a vestigial structure, right? Kind of akin to a tailbone, or to, say getting goosebumps, right? A structure that is there because it was important ancestrally, but it's no longer has that same importance. It's no longer used like it once was. Okay, so we've talked about mammals evolve live birth once. Snakes and lizards evolved at how many times? Over at least 110 times. All right. When we think about organisms kind of being similar or sharing traits, there's kind of two main ways that organisms can share traits. All right. And I'm going to use a couple mammal comparisons to kind of make this point. All right. First off, we have Bjork. All right. And we have, yeah, I'm a Bjork fan. And we have a bonobo right here, right? There's a number of traits that maybe these two mammals share that, other mammals like your pet dog or cat don't share. What are some of the traits that Bjork and this pygmy chimpanzee share? Now they have thumbs, very, very kind of dexterous hands generally, right? What else? What's on those hands? They're at the end. Fingernails, right? Fingernails as opposed to having claws or hooves like other mammals. What are some other traits that Bjork and the bonobo have? Skeleton structure is similar. Bonobos can kind of walk upright. They don't do it for long, but they can do it for periods of time. I'm pretty sure neither of these mammals has an external tail. All right, they probably both have tail bones. Their eyes are in a similar place on the front of their head. One interesting thing that these two mammals share that is not shared with your pet dog or cat is that these mammals can see reds and oranges. The color, right, where most mammals cannot. There's a whole suite of traits that these two mammals share. Right, let's look at these two mammals. What are we looking at right here? We're looking at some seal from New Zealand. We're looking at a harbor porpoise. What traits do these two mammals have the other mammals might not have? Now they have flippers, right? Their forelimbs or flippers help them swim. What else?
Breathable skin. Their skin.
What about their skin?
Like it's breathable in the same way? Like gas exchange the same?
I don't know that there's a lot of, I don't think there's much gas exchange. They probably both have insulation that helps them stay warm in the water. So there's some similarities in their integument that way, right? They're both pretty streamlined. Both of them can use their posterior end to tail region kind of to swim around, right? Right, so think about this. Why is Bjork and a bonobo similar? Why is a seal and a porpoise similar? Right, well, I mentioned that this tool or this diagram called a phylogeny before, right? A phylogeny is depicting evolutionary hypotheses among organisms. This is a phylogeny that includes some dinosaurs, birds, crocodilians, and snakes and lizards there. All right, I mentioned before that birds are technically reptiles. Yeah, if we're calling a crocodilian reptile and a dinosaur reptile the common ancestor of those back here, with lizards, that's also the common ancestor of birds. Right? So we can use phylogenies to think about how organisms are related and to why they share traits. We already did this with our mammals, right? Thinking about why these share live birth and why that one lays eggs, right? Because this common ancestor of marsupials and eutherians gave live birth. Okay, so you can use these tools, phylogenies, that depict evolutionary relationships to think about why organisms are similar. Well, why is Bjork and the bonobo similar? This is a phylogeny of primates, right? We have lemurs up there, we have tarsiers here, we have New World monkeys right here, things like owl monkeys and howler monkeys, etc. We have Old World monkeys right here, things like macaques and baboons, etc. And then on this branch, we have apes, all right? That includes things like the gibbons, includes gorillas. It's not depicted, but if we wanted to, we could draw a dotted line to Bjork right here. And then Bjork and this genus Pan, the chimpanzees, well, those two genera are each other's closest living relatives, right? These two organisms are similar because they share a recent common ancestor and they inherited those similarities from that common ancestor. All right, well, let's use a phylogeny to think about that seal and the porpoise. All right, they're both aquatic marine. They have flippers. They have, they can swim with their back leg. They're very streamlined. But are these two marine mammals close relatives? They are not, all right? This porpoise is more related to a hippopotamus than it is to a seal. This seal is more related to a bear than it is to a porpoise. All right, so there's two ways that organisms can be similar. One of those is via common ancestry. That's known as homology. The other way that organisms can be similar is known as analogy. Another term for that is homoplasy. This is where organisms are similar, not because their common ancestor was similar, right? There's a common ancestor of seals and porpoises back here, but that common ancestor wasn't marine. It didn't have flippers. It wasn't streamlined. It had 4 legs and walked on land like, dogs do or like deer do, right? These two organisms evolved to be similar due to a process called convergent evolution, where environmental pressures essentially kind of find the same solution multiple times. Oh, it's good to have flippers. It's good to be streamlined if you live in the water. So mammals, if you look at the mammals that give live birth, close to 6,000 species, they all gave live birth because their common ancestor gave live birth, right? That's a homology. But with snakes and lizards, giving live birth is not a homology. It's evolved via convergent evolution. It's evolved many different times as a solution to some problem. All right, so we can actually use phylogenies to look at convergent evolution versus homology. So we've talked about our rattlesnakes. You folks were good sports with the rattlesnake eggs. We know this is a pygmy rattlesnake from the southeast United States. We know that they give live birth. Here's a rattlesnake is a type of pit viper. I mentioned those pits help them detect infrared, and pit vipers are in a broader group of snakes called vipers. And some vipers give live birth. Other vipers lay eggs. So this is, you might be thinking, well, I thought we were talking about dragons. Are snakes really dragons? Check out this snake right here. All right, the rough bush viper from Africa. This thing looks like a freaking dragon, even though it's a snake. And guess what? It gives live birth. All right, this dragon lost its eggs. So there was a study a few years back that I thought was interesting, done by a woman named Alison Fenwick and her collaborators, Chris Parkinson and Harry Green. What they did is they created a phylogeny using DNA sequences to reconstruct evolutionary relationships among vipers. And by doing that, they could infer how many times live birth has evolved among these snakes. So this is a phylogeny. These are different genera of vipers. And you can see at the end that there's kind of a little squiggly snake if it gives live birth, and then there's an egg if it's an egg-laying genus. How many times do you think live birth evolved within the viper family? It's pretty impressive. Maybe 19 different times. All right, just within a viper family. And this family isn't necessarily that old. 25 million years. That's kind of this x-axis is showing kind of the relative age of these common ancestors. That's not that old for a snake or reptile or a mammal, but 19 different origins of viviparity, really impressive. Okay, another paper I'm going to highlight really quick. We already mentioned a real dragon right here, right? It's in the genus Draco. This has like the most claim to be a dragon of any animal alive, probably. This genus Draco is in a broader, the family is called Agamidae. But within Agamidae, there's a tribe that it belongs to, a related genera known as the Draconinae. That is the dragon subfamily. There's literally a subfamily of lizards known as the dragon subfamily. How cool is that? And these authors right here, I think a couple Japanese authors and someone else, they were kind of looking at, well, how many times did live birth evolve within the dragon subfamily? This is one of the members of the dragon subfamily right here. This is a genus called Cophotis from the mountains of Sri Lanka. Look at those amazing big scales. All right, so they did a similar thing to the Fenwick et al. Paper where they sequenced DNA from these different lizard species, reconstructed a phylogeny. They weren't just interested in live birth. They were looking at other things as far as whether they were living in trees or living on the ground, whether they were fast-moving lizards or slow-moving lizards. But so these branches are showing kind of where common ancestors are. These columns are depicting the traits that these authors were interested in. This first column is looking at whether they lived in trees, all right? But then this third column is the one that we're interested in, whether these lizards lay eggs or give live birth. Now those little squares in white indicate egg laying, but there are those dark filled-in squares indicate live birth. So how many instances of live birth are there within the dragon subfamily? One, with that Kophotus from Sri Lanka, and then a second one. So this was the focus of the paper. I can't even almost believe that this lizard is real. All right, this thing's definitely gets claimed to be called a dragon, right? Look at that nose, look at that tail. This is a super rare lizard from Borneo that has like almost never been collected. They found one and were able to get DNA. That's kind of what motivated this study. And they found that this lizard that gives live birth is not a close relative of the other dragon that gives live birth. Two separate origins within the dragon subfamily. All right. I guess I show it really fast. So does anyone recognize what kind of animal this is? I think this is adorable. This is definitely a macro shot because these are actually very small lizards. This is a little lizard known as chameleons. You guys have heard of chameleons, right? This study, I can't remember the authors, right? Oh, Hughes et al. They were looking at how many times viviparity evolved in chameleons, and kind of they're looking at whether they lived in trees or on the ground as well. If these branches are in green, they live in trees. If they're brown, they live on the ground. What we're focusing on, do they lay eggs or give live birth? Again, those kind of bars that are white indicate egg laying. Those that are dark indicate live birth. How many times did live birth evolve in chameleons? 3. Pretty cool. Maybe we can watch a quick video of chameleon giving live birth. This is a chameleon in the genus Bradypodium. Someone's pet chameleon. You see a little bit of yolk right there? Kind of looks like a ball of goo. Wait a minute. It falls onto a leaf, and then what happens? The baby wriggles out, breaks through that amniotic membrane, now free, and it can breathe. All right? And yeah, it's attached to that yolk, that little attachment will dry off, dry out, and that yolk will become detached. Now it's on its way to being a little chameleon eating crickets and flies, etc. All right? Pretty cool. All right, but almost certainly a lacithotrophic example of viviparity. That means, again, using nutrients from yolk, excuse me. Okay, so my own research, I've worked on a group of lizards known as, well, they're in the family Anguidae. These are a couple California species right here. Does anyone recognize these species? One of the chapters of my dissertation, I essentially made a phylogeny for this genus of lizards. These are they're in the genus Alligator. They're known as alligator lizards. They kind of look like alligator lizards, and then they bite really hard, and they kind of roll around if they're on your finger, kind of like a death roll of an alligator. They're kind of aptly named, I think. So I looked at these. Interestingly, most members of this genus, like this is called the California alligator lizard. It lays eggs. This is called the northern alligator lizard. It does also live in California, but kind of the Bay Area, at high elevations of the Sierra Nevada. This gives live birth. All right. So while I worked on this during my dissertation, there was another student in my lab. Her name was Angela Marion, and she was also working in the same family. And she was working on other genera of alligator lizards. These genera of alligator lizards are found in central southern Mexico, Guatemala, a little bit into Honduras as well. And these are the flashy alligator lizards. These things are beautiful. Some of these are arboreal, living in trees. Look at this thing. This is just like a little jewel that lives in trees. This one is actually, they get as far south as Costa Rica. This is from the cloud forests of Costa Rica. It lives on the ground. A couple more. Well, so we, in English, oftentimes these are referred to as alligator lizards, like arboreal alligator lizards, right? Here's one right here. This one's from the state of Chiapas in southern Mexico. What does that thing look like to you? All right, here's one from the state of Guerrero. What does that look like to you? So over the past, I don't know how long, herpetologists in Mexico have started using a different name for these lizards. Guess what they call them? Dragoncitos, all right? Little dragons. I love that, all right? I really like that. So yeah, they look like little dragons. I mean, come on, look at that thing back here with those little spines coming off the back. That looks like a little dragon. That sounds to me, that sounds better than like arboreal alligator lizard. Let's call them the Dragoncitos, little dragons. All right, so Angela and I, well, Angela, this work took place years ago. I won't say how long, but we had DNA samples from different alligator lizards. She did the bulk of the work using PCR to amplify different gene fragments in order to reconstruct one of those phylogenies. I've kind of stepped in. I've sequenced another handful of genes to kind of go along with the genes that Angela sequenced in the lab. Additionally, kind of over the summer, I figured out, well, there's a resource to get genetic information that you can kind of use in your own studies known as GenBank. So when I publish my research on lizard genetics, I actually have to publish the sequences I generate to GenBank. Then if other people want to use those sequences to check my work or to do their own analyses, they can. So I've long used sequences from GenBank. What's happened kind of somewhat more recently is that, you know, there's been these major breakthroughs in sequencing, and folks now sequence genomes, right? They get a lot of data. That data can be a little bit tricky to, well, I don't necessarily have the skill set to analyze it in a really detailed way, but I've found in GenBank, this sequence read archive, I've actually figured out over the summer how I can pull some of this genomic data down and kind of plug it into my data set and maybe make that data set more complete, have a few more species. So I've gotten kind of Angela's lab work, my own lab work, and then this published data from GenBank over the summer to get kind of a more complete data set to make a phylogeny for the Dragoncitos, all right? And this is a phylogeny that I generated here. You don't need to see all these different names, but here's the Alligator that I did for my dissertation. Some of these are in California and Baja California. This group right here is essentially the southern Mexico, Guatemala group of the Dragoncitos living in the trees. And what I've color-coded this, where essentially those branches, those species in red, give live birth. Those species in blue are thought to lay eggs, right? So in this group of Dragoncitos and some strange relatives up there, so this data set, it's not very big by kind of modern standards relative to genomic data, but it is about 10,000 base pairs, 11 different genes. Not that long ago, it would have been a pretty respectable data set, and it's still a good data set. These are still good data that can be analyzed. There's different ways to make phylogenies. We won't go into those details, but with these inferred evolutionary relationships, we can say, well, how many times did this family, Anguidae, evolve live birth? How many times do we think it is? We think it's 3, right? So there's 1 with the northern alligator lizard I mentioned, 1 with this central Mexican Guatemalan group, and then up there, you see that group in red called Anguis. That isn't the same family, but it's not a Dragoncito. It's a European lizard that's completely limbless, known as the worm lizard, all right? I don't think they look that wormy, but they do lack limbs. They look a little more snaky, but they're related to alligator lizards, and yes, this doesn't lay eggs, it gives live birth. Okay. I'm not going to show details, but a related group to alligator lizards in the same general kind of lizards are a subgroup called gallowasps. This is an amazing species of gallowasp from Costa Rica, Colombia, Ecuador, where it's sometimes known as the madre de coral, which means like the mother of coral snakes. It's not a snake, it's a lizard, but it has the bright coloration of coral snakes. Most of the members of this group, there's about 45 to 50 species, most of them give live birth. But there's maybe 5 or so that lay eggs, and I've depicted them here. One is a Costa Rican Panama species. That's the female with her eggs. This is that Madre de Coral, the female, with her eggs. And this is a Cuban species, Diploglossum de la Sagra, also with eggs. What do you notice with all of these situations? The females are guarding the eggs. And that seems to be a trend, not just with gallowasps, but with the alligator lizards as well. As opposed to those egg layers, this is a Brazilian species called Diploglossum lasode. When they're born, these ones are, like I said, most species give live birth. These ones were live born. They have this really kind of zebra-like pattern. That zebra-like pattern disappears when they get bigger. It's thought that this pattern is actually mimicking kind of poisonous millipedes. Really kind of cool. All right. So without going into all the details, with gallowasps, I've done the same thing, made a phylogeny. Most species do give live birth. 5 or 6 species lay eggs, and making a phylogeny, we think we can infer how many times live birth evolved. We think it evolved 5 different times. And again, a cool thing with this is we think the prerequisite essentially for evolving live birth is the fact that the egg layers, the mother always guards the eggs. Most lizards don't do that. All right, most lizards, find a nice place for their eggs, they lay them, leave them alone. But maybe this egg guarding is some step towards developing live birth. All right, and just really short, we don't know for sure how many times live birth evolved in this group because we don't know how all of these different species actually reproduce. There's not enough known about them. This is a species from southern Brazil, like near Brasilia, Rio de Janeiro. This is cool. It's called Diploglossum fasciatus. It's actually the type of the subfamily it's in. We know so little about this lizard. We don't even know whether it lays eggs or gives live birth. If we were to find out that this lays eggs, it would mean at least 2 more origins of viviparity than we're already inferring. So some of what I'm saying, keep in mind, you can put a little asterisk there as you can with much science. This is our understanding right now. That hypothesis can be tested and potentially rejected with additional data. All right, so how does live birth evolve? You don't just go from laying eggs to having live birth. If you look at snakes and lizards, oviparity, laying eggs is most common, right? So what goes on with oviparity? There's a little bit of incubation in the mother where the embryo develops to a very small size. The eggs are laid, and then most of the development is taking place outside of the mother in the egg. Whereas with viviparity, which is also pretty common, right, with over 110 origins, we know that all of the development is taking place inside of the mother, whether it's lacithotrophic or placentotrophic. Now, interestingly, there are some lizards that are kind of transitional, not a whole lot, where there's initial incubation that goes longer than is typical for an egg-laying lizard. The embryo gets to be bigger. All right, so the embryo has a pretty big head start before that egg is laid, and then external incubation, external development kind of finishes it off. So that is a stepping stone, but it appears to be kind of not a state that species kind of stay on, right? They can ultimately go to that internal incubation. So, and this is a lot of words. I'll try to go through it quickly. How does this happen? How do lizards evolve to be viviparous? Well, kind of the first step is that there's a stage where eggs are being retained longer in the mother. Those proteins, the phylogenies in the yolk, are still needed, but what would have to happen if you're holding an egg, if the mother is holding an egg inside of her, what changes would need to happen to the mother, to the eggs, in order for that to work? I think those embryos need oxygen. And they need to dump off their carbon dioxide. How's that going to happen? It can't happen with a thick eggshell. All right, so one of the first things that happens is that the eggshell starts to get very thin, and then you have more blood vessels in the oviduct, or the structure in the female that's holding those eggs in order to deliver that oxygen. So as that happens, essentially that species kind of becomes more committed to the live bearing mode, and the eggshell gets to be thinner and thinner, even though those yolks are still present. Now, at some stage, certain species essentially switch from using yolk, using that vitellogenin. They start to have some sort of connection to the mother. Maybe instead of, since they're having a thin eggshell, maybe they need calcium from the mother for the bones to grow. All right. Otherwise, Komodo dragon, the egg, its calcium is coming from the shell itself. So there's it's not just gas exchange coming from the mother. Other nutrients are moving from the mother to the embryo as well. Then what starts to happen? Essentially, you start to have more connection between the embryo and the female. You start to develop a placenta, right? In mammals, there's kind of two types of placenta, the marsupial and the eutherian. In lizards, there are dozens of types of placentas. They're all based on those same membranes, right? Mostly the chorion and allantois, but how they evolved is a little bit different in each one. So essentially, as a placenta becomes more developed, there's less of a need to supply nutrients to the young with yolk, right? And so those vitellogenins, those proteins, become diminished or maybe even vanish. So essentially, there are lizards that have quote-unquote mammalian-like placentas, meaning really strong attachments between developing embryo and mother. Essentially, all of the nutrients needed for embryo development are taking place through that placenta. A couple of examples include this South American lizard called Mabuya, Copes mabuya. This is kind of the most famous lizard known for having a mammal-like placenta. The lizard I studied for my master's, and there's multiple species in this genus here in Southern California, are the night lizards, genus Xanthusia. And these are also thought to be kind of have a mammal-like placenta where there's no yolk, there's not a lot of yolk involved at all, right? All that nutrition for the developing embryo is coming from the placenta. Okay, so remember there are a lot of egg-laying lizards and snakes. There are a lot of live-bearing lizards and snakes. Not a lot of transitory ones, kind of ones in the middle, but there are some remarkable ones. This is a study that came out just a couple years ago, and look at the title of this. An extraordinary feat pulled off by a lizard could suggest a species is going through a rare evolutionary transition. This is a skink, that's a type of lizard found in southeastern Australia. And I think you can see it all right here. I've kind of highlighted here. It says, recently a three-toed skink pulled off an extraordinary feat. It laid 3 eggs and delivered another baby through live birth in the same pregnancy. What? All right, a mother lizard said, oh, I'll lay some eggs. I'm going to keep on to this one though. I'll give birth to it a little while later. Like, how wild is that? Okay, and it's not the only species of lizard that can do that. There are 2 others. So there's 3 kinds of lizards that are kind of like right on that cusp of evolving viviparity, where they're laying eggs sometimes and giving birth other times. That's remarkable. I mean, I honestly, it blows my mind thinking about it. Okay, so in transit, before I get there. So why has live birth evolved so many times in snakes and lizards, 110 times? Well, the general thinking is that most of the time live birth is correlated with lizards and snakes living in cooler environments, whether it's extreme latitudes or high elevations. And you can kind of think why that would be important, right? Cooler environments, temperatures are going to be colder, more variable. It'll be harder to lay eggs and have them develop at the right temperature. So instead, a female can essentially keep the eggs inside of her. She can go around basking and more or less, she has control over the temperature those eggs incubate, right? And by her having control over incubation times, that kind of gets down the path towards live birth. So multiple studies have shown this. There is a correlation between cold temperatures and live birth. Keep in mind, though, there are some snakes and lizards that live in cold places that don't have live birth. There are snakes and lizards that do have live birth that live in warm places. But nonetheless, maybe the origin of live birth still is tied to, say, high elevation. In fact, there's a hypothesis that was published, I think, 2 years ago, that it's saying that its idea is not, it's not all about just temperature. Maybe there's also an issue with how much oxygen is available. higher elevations, there's less oxygen present. Those embryos developing kind of burn through a lot of oxygen, and maybe by having those embryos develop inside of the female can kind of control the amount of oxygen that those embryos get and can make sure it's high enough for proper development to occur. So it might not just be tied to coldness, it might be tied to low oxygen at high elevations. I'm not sure how much other biologists kind of agree with the hypothesis, but nonetheless it's an interesting, if not alternative, kind of supplement to the cold temperature hypothesis. All right, so in short, how did the dragons lose their eggs? Well, they've done it all over the place, right? At least 110 different times. Lizards and snakes are the group of organisms that you should study if you want to understand why live birth evolves. Now, you don't want to deal with mammals. That happened a single time in the Jurassic over 150 million years ago. Why not study a group of animals where they're continually evolving live birth? And making phylogenies is kind of a crucial key to understanding how it's happened. And that's kind of one of the things that, again, I've been involved in. And again, you've seen that live birth runs the gamut or the spectrum from ones that are essentially just holding on to their eggs till the last minute to other lizards that are very mammal-like with their very developed placentas. So, I've kind of focused on phylogenetic work that identifies how many times it's happened. Other researchers are they're sequencing genomes and try to identify what specific genes are involved with undergoing this transition to live birth. It's something I wish I could do, but that's definitely beyond my expertise. All right, so lizards and snakes have evolved live birth 110 different times. They're up here in the Lepidosauurs. Here are our other reptiles right here, including birds. Yes, they're grouped on the reptilian tree. We have crocodilians. A crocodile is more related to a bird than it is to a lizard. And then turtles. What do you think? How many times have turtles, crocodilians, and birds evolved live birth? If lizards and snakes have done it 110 times, how about birds and crocodilians? None. Goose egg. Okay. Anyway, yeah, it hasn't happened at all. That goose egg was a pun. Anyway, so thinking about crocodilians and birds being relatives, they share a number of traits. Crocodilians and birds both have four-chambered hearts. They both can vocalize and sing during mating season. They both lay eggs, and they both build and guard nests. And remember I showed you a phylogeny before where birds essentially share common ancestry with dinosaurs, and then a common ancestor with dinosaurs, birds, and crocodilians. We can infer that that common ancestor had a four-chambered heart, sang or vocalized, laid eggs, built nests. And it's probably not just birds and crocodilians that never evolved live birth. There's no evidence of true dinosaurs evolving live birth either. Maybe there's something physiologically about how they produce eggs that prevent them from transitioning to live birth like lizards and snakes do. Maybe it's a really calcified shell, maybe it's some other aspect, but something has kept them from ever evolving live birth. Okay, here is a dinosaur. This dinosaur was named Oviraptor because it was found and associated with eggs, and Oviraptor means egg thief. That's kind of a mean thing to name that dinosaur, egg thief. Why is it doing hanging around with those eggs? Why do you think this fossil, here's the dinosaur stuck on these eggs, why do you think that dinosaur fossil was actually found with a bunch of eggs? It was incubating them. It was a mother dinosaur. Can you imagine, the mother's devotion encased in rock for millions of years? Like, wow, what a great mother dinosaur. And then some human comes along, oh, you're an egg thief. That's rude. That's just rude. Okay. So viviparity has evolved in other groups beyond amniotes. Sharks are a fascinating example that I don't know a whole lot about, but there's some crazy stuff with shark live birth. This is a great white shark. They give live birth. Live birth has evolved 7 different times in sharks. All right. Bony fish have evolved live birth. Does anyone know what fish this is? is a coelacanth, all right? This fish is more related to you than it is to your goldfish or to a trout, all right? This is a lobe-finned fish that's related to, you know, amniotes and amphibians. Interestingly, coelacanths also give live birth. And I just read this afternoon, guess how long they're pregnant for? Only 5 years. Okay. And it's not just vertebrates that give live birth. Did you know that all scorpions, as far as I know, give live birth? Does that kind of make you like scorpions a little bit more? I like them a little bit more. At least in California, where none of the scorpions are particularly dangerous. I just learned, like this past year, I've gotten really into roly-polies and isopods. I learned early this year that, guess what? Most crustaceans lay eggs, but roly-polies and other terrestrial isopods do not. They give live birth. How cool is that? It's really cool, especially if you see some little tiny baby roly-polies. They're so cute. All right, and then, you know, so there's a lot of cool organisms out there across the animal kind of tree of life where you can look at these really cool questions of reproduction and live birth. You know, we're barely scratching the surface talking about lizards, right? So, yeah, maybe you should think about taking a zoology class or something like that to learn about this kind of thing. What's an interesting example of live birth that's kind of really out there, that doesn't really fit into the categories we've talked about, but is live birth in a kind of funky way? I'm not really setting up the question, but you probably know what I'm talking about. Well, it gives birth to babies, but in a like, what's that doing, giving birth to babies? What's up with seahorses? They're not really horses. Okay. They are fish. Yeah, what's going on?
The male gives birth to
The male gives birth, right? So that's kind of a funky situation where the female is producing eggs, but then the male ends up pregnant, all right? We're going to make that even a little bit weirder as we end this. Look at this paper that came out last year. Male seahorses grow placentas to incubate their young. All right, what does that mean? It means the pouch where those eggs are held become very vascularized. I don't know how many nutrients are actually transferred from the male to the young, but one of the reasons that that placenta grows is for gas exchange. You have a stomach full of like little tiny seahorses, they need their oxygen, right? The only way to get them that oxygen is to have these little infoldings and blood vessels delivering that oxygen and sucking away that carbon dioxide so, so they can develop properly. So again, there's some fun tricks out there in the animal world as far as reproduction goes. Okay, so we'll end there. I guess we're still within our hour and a half, but I took a little longer than I thought. But I'm ending with this very dragon-like Bornean earless monitor. I, technically have a few minutes for questions if anyone has questions about what we talked about. No questions? You're now experts in snake and lizard reproduction. Hopefully, you're on your way. Yeah.
You said to think about that one image. You showed a video of a live birth, and with it, some of the very thin shell came out of it. Would that be that intermediate type of?
Yeah, that's right. So I would think that if you think about how long, where that lizard is on the trajectory towards live birth,
yeah,
that it was kind of on the intermediate, and maybe it's only kind of recently gone from egg laying to live birth.
And
The
maybe
fact.
that thin shell, the egg inside.
Exactly. Right. So maybe, 5 million years later, that shell will essentially be gone or something like that. Right. Exactly. So yeah, it's far away from having the, placenta, mammal-like placenta that some lizards have. Great question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I guess I'll end really fast. Thinking about eggs, thinking about phylogenies. If you ever want a solution to what came first, the chicken or the egg, we can make a phylogeny, think about eggs, and we can answer that question, right? We have snakes and lizards here. We have turtles here. We have crocodilians and birds here. When did eggs evolve? They're back here, all right? The ancestor of all these amniotes. When did chickens evolve? Way later. Okay, so what came first, the chicken or the egg? Phylogeny answers it easy, all right? You can go, back in the Jurassic and get a, egg McMuffin. There's nary a chicken around, okay? I don't know if you can get an egg McMuffin, but you could get an omelet, all right? So, anyway, good times with eggs. If no questions, then yeah, thanks for coming out. I appreciate it. If you're my students, of course, fill out the kind of complete your assignments showing that you paid a little bit of attention. I saw you all.